So I missed last week, unfortunately. I mean, I did read it. I read it, these last two sections on an airplane, and um, and a little while ago. So I've tried to review it, but they're not the freshest things. So not being terribly familiar with Hegel, these last two sections were more of a struggle, but at least they were short. I don't know if, and of course, we're going to get Hunter's response eventually here tonight, I hope. But I don't know if Eric, can you speak to? I mean, what I was wondering about is the accuracy of if you whether you think Heidegger gives Hegel a fair interpretation.
Well, I'm not, yeah. Just from what I can see, it seems to be a fairly straightforward, uncontroversial reading of Hegel. I haven't read that section of the encyclopedia directly, but it all rings fairly consonant with the mainstream.
Well, I actually kind of understood some of the stuff he said about Hegel, which was new for me. So I mean, if it's a fair representation of Hegel, that's good because I actually understood some of what he said. Um, so I don't know. Does anyone have any particular place you want to start, particular questions? I mean, I've got one or two myself, but I'll.
Yeah, so there's one thing about the his interpretation of Hegel that I thought was interesting is he stresses that it's a formal, logical, schematic, the specifically the dialectic. He calls it says that it eventually takes a rigid schematic form, which I remember when we were doing the logic of Deleuze thing. Uh, the there's a controversy over whether Hegel's dialectic or whatnot, whether it was formal or not, or to what extent. And it seems like Heidegger is very much on the side that this is a logical, formalistic uh, phenomena, the dialectic, and that seemed a little. I don't know. It seems I don't know enough to be able to say that that's bullshit or not, but it seems like that's probably a pretty contentious thing for him to claim. I'm guessing, but I don't really know.
What's
But
the
anyway,
passage?
it
What's,
definitely, yeah.
so I just wondered what passage you had in mind. Is there a
Oh,
particular
I've
one?
marked a few of them. So let me see. It was so 430, the very end of 432, right before the B, the kind of subsection B, there's a part there that says, only from the standpoint of this formal dialectical conception of time can Hegel produce any connection between time and spirit. And then the sentence before that, here the sequence of nows has been formalized in the most extreme sense and leveled off in such a way that one could hardly go any further. And then he says and then the first paragraph of that B section, he says, grasping this differentiation, a differentiation of the difference. That's a very Hegelian sounding phrase. Thus, Hegel can define the essence of the spirit formally and apophantically as the negation of a negation. This absolute negativity gives a logically formalized interpretation of Descartes' cogito me cogitare rem, wherein he sees the essence of the conscientia. So, a logically formalized interpretation of Descartes' cogito. That's so. There's a few other places where I see another one too. So 435 also, he talks about, let's see, the beginning of this paragraph. By going back to the self-sameness of the formal structure, which both spirit and time possesses the negation of a negation. So he's stressing really that negation of a negation is the thing that seems to be the formal.
Right.
Hegel shows how it is possible for spirit to be actualized historically in time. Spirit and time get disposed of with the very emptiest of formal ontological and formal epiphantical abstractions. And this makes it possible to produce a kinship between them. So I think those are the main parts there. And then also in the long footnote where he mentions Bergson, before that he talks about, okay, this whole footnote is quite interesting. He uses this kind of like it's like a circumspectual, am I using that word right? I don't know. Circumspectual evidence that because Hegel was working with Aristotle around a certain time, and also that Bergson also was writing about Aristotle at the same time that he came out with this essay, that they're obviously connected. But anyways, the part that something like halfway through that the second paragraph, though the dialectic already emerges, it does not have as yet the rigid schematic form that it will take afterwards. Yeah. So it seems like there's a shift also, which I've heard, the Hegel of the encyclopedia is a little more, I mean, he's old man Hegel, which, I guess that's maybe more rigid, schematic, formal, I guess. I don't know. Seems like Heidegger's at least implying that. So, yeah, I don't know I can't assess Heidegger's reading of Hegel necessarily, but it definitely jumped out to me as something that was just interesting.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure. I mean, actually, that I didn't read the footnote. The print is too small. But that's the one where he's most clearly, it is most clearly that Heidegger is objecting to dialectic itself as formalistic. But I think a lot of the other passages, I wonder if they could be. I mean, it's not an objection to Hegel. It's just stating Hegel to say that the dialectic is a logic, right? That's Hegel says that. So it's this formal word that marks an objection, and I don't know where I'm getting this from, but I wondered if it's actually I mean, you could see Heidegger as giving a more sympathetic general interpretation of Hegel, and he does. There are elements of sympathy in this by I mean emphasizing the fact that this fall into time, this weird metaphor, that's central to Heidegger's interpretation. It does seem like that is a failure of the dialectic, right? It's what does Hegel mean by falling? Spirit falls into time. That's bullshit for the dialectic. That's not a part of the dialectic. It's just some weird contingency. And so there, I mean, I guess I took Heidegger's objection to be not necessarily. Maybe he also objects to the dialectic. I mean, I'm sure he does. But specifically, it's like Hegel hasn't lived up to his own like dialectical method at this crucial moment in the relationship between Geist and time, right? That's a falling as opposed to any kind of real dialectical maneuver. And that's isn't that sort of the sense of what he's saying, right? There's this dialectical understanding of how space turns into time, and there's this dialectical understanding of spirit, both as the negation of a negation, right? But there's no dialectical relationship between spirit and time. That's mediated by this formal similarity, right? They share this property of both being negations of negations. They say this property, as it were, of both being dialectical. So that there actually isn't a dialectical relationship. They're allied only by this conceptual, not in the Hegelian sense, but in the Aristotelian sense, by this conceptual or formal similarity. And you could read that as an internal objection to Hegel, right? Hegel's failed to make a dialectical relationship between spirit and time. And then Heidegger's like, well, why is that? Well,
yeah, that's interesting.
Standard argument.
Because he does kind of start with Dasein being fallen in time. Like he ties temporality to the human condition. So he starts with that. And it seems like he's like not necessarily rejecting everything Hegel's saying, but that he's pointing out where it doesn't fall, like where things are not necessarily ontological. That's an excellent observation.
Yeah, I feel like he's quite sympathetic to Hegel. I mean, not ultimately, but moderately sympathetic.
So I wonder, I mean, it makes me wonder if part of the reason, reminded of the moves that some of the German idealists make when they're trying to solve a previous problem. So, trying to remember, Fichte, it seems like the self-positing I, because it's an activity, he starts with as an activity, so he avoids the problem of reifying a transcendental subject. And so, like you've got there's this potential problem with Kant, and then by making it this dynamic process, then that sort of addresses that from the outset. And he puts freedom, because Kant has this little difficulty with freedom, and so Fichte puts freedom right there at the very beginning. Is Heidegger doing something similar in regard to, as Joseph pointed out, making, grounding Dasein in temporality? Is that this structure of temporality has been difficult from the beginning, and so one way to address that is to, ground his ontology from the very beginning in temporality. So the formal structure thing, is that just that it's the negation of negation? That's what it's just kind of empty in a sense that it's. I mean, I get the deal that it doesn't show. It just shows a formal similarity between spirit and time, so that's a problem. But then, as far as why he's calling it formal, it's just because it's a negation of a negation that doesn't have any real content to it. Is that a way to
Yeah, all right. I guess it's that the same kind of formula is being applied no matter what the content, and that it's always the negation of a negation is going on. So it has to be rendered as such. I think that's what would be considered the formal aspect, where I think that the idea of a kind of a formal structure also is this idea of, the invariant self-sameness of these structures It's the negation of negation, no matter what, every time, applied to whatever it is, history, space, time. So I think it's something like that.
So it's kind of like an a priori, but not in the Kantian sense, but in the methodological sense. It's like every time I come up to a problem, I'm just going to say it's dialectical in this particular way. So he just says you can analyze the spirit dialectically, and so now we're just going to apply the same methodology to time without having any real reason to do so, other than that you want to be consistent.
I think the idea in Hegel is that any object that reason can take for itself should be rendered dialectically if we're going to do it in a full-blooded, rational way. If we're going to take reason all the way through, we will find contradictions, and then we will sublate them. And so something like spirit and time already present themselves as not just things in the world, but objects of reason. So kind of render more than many things that could be studied by philosophers, kind of top tier of list of things to give a dialectical kind of reading or spin or analysis.
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily think Chase's reading is wrong. I just think that there's two. I think there's just two available readings of what Heidegger is doing there. So and Chase's is, I mean, and I think that maybe there's textual evidence for it. Chase's is right. There's something wrong. It's always the same. This goddamn negation of a negation, right? It's turned into a formal structure. And
That's
and I think
dialectic,
right, and that's the in the back of my mind, so Nevitt was saying Kant, and I think Kant is very much in the background here because it's Kant has that notion of formal mediation is something that that's clearly Kantian, right? How do intuition and concept come into contact with each other? Well, they have to have something formal in common, and it turns out it's time in a Critique of Pure Reason, in a schematism and whatnot. Hegel is building off of that in developing the dialectic and wants to reject it. So he wants to reject this notion that the things are related to each other only by a process of formal mediation. So officially, Hegel wants to reject that. And so that makes me think, that when Heidegger is presenting Hegel in terms of formal mediation, it's some kind of a failure. It's an internal failure. Hegel is failing at the thing, Heidegger is saying, at the thing that Hegel's trying to do. And then the question is kind of, is that failure general or is it localized? And I think there's things to be said about in favor of both. Clearly, Hegel sometimes just does become rote and formulaic, and certainly Hegelians are often a bit rote and formulaic about the negation of the negation. And I have an anecdote in my background that I'm just going to ignore. Repress anecdote. But I think it's also possible that Heidegger's it's more limited, and it's this word "fall." I think his emphasis on that word "fall" just makes it look as if because that's such an undialectical word. That makes it look as if the dialectic was working pretty well, and he was avoiding formalism in these two realms, but he just never connected them together properly. And it's a weak spot in his philosophy, and that for Heidegger that's then his point of entrance. And never, I think you're right. It's not. I don't think that's simplistic. What you were saying about it is like a bit like Fischer. It is like a sort of typical German idealist move, right? How do you get from spirit to time? And Heidegger's answer is you don't, because you're already there in time.
It didn't fall. Its being is in time, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah. And that it sounds flip, except that we're at the end of this huge book that's actually talked really a lot about temporality. So it's less flip when it's section 83 or whatever it is.
But to Eric's point, and again, revealing my relative ignorance of these things, but if so, I'll probably express this incorrectly, but if Hegel thinks that if everything is, the real is the rational is real, if everything that it is possible for us to make sense of, we can only make sense of through the use of reason, and if reason by its very nature is dialectical, then how else could you understand anything at a fundamental level other than through the dialectic? I mean, that, at least if that's the case, that seems to be less artificial, because if he's, well, surely, I mean, time, like everything else, if you understand it fundamentally, you're going to have to understand it through reason, which means you're going to have to understand it through the dialectic. So I don't know, what am I missing there?
It's just, I mean, I think part of the problem is kind of what I intimating earlier, the dialectic of the dialectic itself. In Hegel and after Hegel, it becomes a static system and a dynamic system. It prides itself on its dynamism, and at the same time, it's got this ultimate, reconciliation of everything in the absolute idea. That never changes. And everything is a negation of a negation. That never changes. And so it kind of falls away from its dynamism. And so there's two aspects of this dialectic, especially as it is practiced, in the hands of philosophers. And so by the time we get to Hegel, or not, by the time we get to Heidegger, there is a kind of, I want to say, when Chase was saying earlier, this reading of Hegel as giving a very formal and static, kind of rigid system, this is, I mean, it's contrary to Hegel's own purported aims, but I think there's a lot of people at the end of the 19th and early 20th century that say, well, that's what he wound up with, because he was trying to, give a logical system, and it was a idealist kind of take, and everything is subsumed under this web of concepts, and in the hands of all these Hegelians, this web of concepts just stays the same. There's all these negations, and it's just applied in different, minutia of the world. But, nobody's really revising Hegel's dialectic as such, right? It's become a static system in the hands of certain people. So I think that's part of what Heidegger is reacting to. So I think when Chase was looking at this and saying, oh, that doesn't seem to be a fair reading of Hegel, I think maybe it's because you're coming at it from 2024 after a number of people like Zizek in particular have tried to resurrect Hegel or rescue from Hegel, rescue Hegel from his idealism, to be frank, and I think that's what Heidegger's reacting here is against Hegel's idealism. And so if we're speaking now after a couple of people have tried to rescue Hegel from his idealism and read Heidegger trying to critique Hegel vis-a-vis his idealism, it might not seem fair, but ultimately, I'm waiting for Hunter to jump on at any moment and tell us that Hegel wasn't an idealist. Honestly, in the broad sweep of things, I think it's fair. I think it's a fair characterization.
Yeah. So it's not necessarily that I think I'm trying to. I legitimately don't know if Heidegger's reading of Hegel is not fair or not, but I was just trying to mainly kind of predict exactly what was going on in terms of how Heidegger sees Hegel as this kind of overly formal kind of thing going on. But I think that emphasis on his idealism definitely was another thing that jumped out at me. And after I read this, I was thinking, how the hell do people get, well, the whole Zizek thing of there's some kind of materialist Hegel? I don't know. I've never exactly gotten that. Not that I've really tried, but uh, I don't know. It seems like the way that not Hegel, Heidegger definitely pushes that angle of the idealism of Hegel. The whole spirit is the concept. It has to think itself through. That's how it actualizes itself in history and time and whatnot. And yeah, with that, I definitely, yeah, I'm curious to see how do people get not how do people rescue Hegel from the idealism? I don't understand that.
Well, in order to do that, we need to throw out some random Lacan and Hegel in parallel, and then problem solved. Sorry, I'm done. I'm done. I'm sorry.
I think you can excavate moments out of Hegel. I think his system and his project is idealist. But I think part of what makes him amenable to, again, Marx and Engels and a lot of the 19th century materialism was kind of grown out of Hegel's dialectic, and it's not a vulgar materialism, right? So there are moments of Hegel's dialectical moves where he's precisely trying to avoid the formalism of abstract thinking and trying to get to the content through the formalism of abstract thinking, but he never, does he get to the content? Does he get to the material? That's for us to question. But at least there's moments where he's deploying concepts to try to get to, beyond the concepts or enrich the concepts in a way that, prior philosophers maybe didn't quite. I mean, Aristotle somewhat vis-a-vis Plato, right? Hegel vis-a-vis Kant, right? Tries to get back to the material things out there, but within this paradigm of thinking of German idealism. So I still think, I think a lot of, it's fairly uncontroversial to say Hegel was an idealist, but there are moments where he seems, of the idealists, the one most concerned to also account for what is outside of the concept. Again, 20th century philosophy, Frankfurt School critique is he never really, everything is, ultimately he just subsumes everything under concepts. He never breaks out of a web of concepts.
I have to say Schelling is a possible monkey wrench in your thinking there. But yeah. Yeah, I kind of forgot about the whole Marx thing where yeah, it was like, oh yeah, that's a materialist reading of Hegel. So I guess then there's something being transferred over from Hegel to Marx where he's like, okay, we'll keep the dialectic, some aspect of the dialectic, but we'll make it's about material now, which then kind of brings back, well, maybe that's the whole, you can see where there's a kind of formal structure there, which can be, okay, it can be taken somewhat out of this kind of self-reflexive relation with the concept developing itself to now it's about, okay, the dialectic, maybe we can conceptually understand it, but it's a dynamic that's involved with material reality in history. I guess that's something kind of like what Marx is somewhat getting at. I don't know.
I'm gonna share my anecdote
Yay.
because maybe it's relevant. So I was taught by a Hegelian. This is all very British specific.
Are you okay? Are you okay, Alistair?
I survived. What can I say? It was not the worst thing that happened to me at graduate school. So
Oh my
there you
Lord,
go.
that's a bar.
Yeah, and she was a very nutty Hegelian, Gillian Rose, but she died. Oh yeah, I see Eric is a fan. Yeah, she died tragically young, like 40
Yes.
something. And her
Warwick?
say what?
Did you go to Warwick?
Yeah,
Okay, cool.
yeah. So I was in her Hegel seminar, which she held in her office with like 6 of us. And she refused. She had one. She had no central lighting. She had one like angle poise lamp, one of those lamps you can shift around, and she would direct it at the floor, so that we were in this like gloom, in this Hegelian gloom. And I remember this one time, some bright young kid who's an analytical Marxist from Oxford, who was come to Warwick for graduate school, and he'd done like this. We were reading the Phenomenology of Spirit, and he'd done this like incredibly elaborate diagram of all the kind of thesis, antithesis, synthesis loops in the first part of the in the first part of the phenomenology, and this was his presentation. And he gave that, and she yelled at him for Eric because he's reifying the dialectic and making it this kind of formal process, like it chases objection to Marx turning Hegel on his head, is that if you can do that, then the dialectic is some formal structure that you can preserve within that shift. But Gillian Rose was like, no, that's a terrible way of doing it. You're not doing Hegel then. And in the break, it was the year that Sinead O'Connor released that album. I can't remember what the name of it is. Didn't we remember what the name? She just died, right? Sinead O'Connor. So I'm talking, this is really very past history for you all, isn't it? But she just came out with an album. And he started talking about that album, and how it made him feel like in different ways. And she overheard that conversation, and she was like, "That's Hegel right there. You are experiencing your contradictions. Why did you this formal bullshit rip up that formal bullshit? That's irrelevant. That's ridiculous." Hegel is a phenomenologist. Even the logic is a phenomenology. And it's about experiencing your contradictions. And at the social level, it's about society experiencing its contradictions. And there's a live sense of Hegel there. It's orthogonal to the question of idealism, materialism. But there's a live sense of Hegel there that's not this rigidly formalistic dialectic. And we need to, the text is ambiguous and difficult and dead. The text is always dead. So there's just, how do we revivify it, was Gillian Rose's kind of problematic. How do we revivify that Hegelian text? I'm sounding really enthusiastic about Hegel now, which I'm not. But don't get me wrong.
Just to clarify that.
I just want to get that on the table there. But yeah, I do feel like I feel similar ambivalence in Heidegger's text. And I kind of feel like I want to defend Hegel a bit and see in Heidegger like he's pointing at a failure, like a place where Hegel has failed to live up to his own conception of the dialectic, right? That's a place where actually we can be more Hegelian than Hegel, maybe. Heidegger, more Hegelian than Hegel. That's my slogan.
Yeah, insofar as it constitutes imminent critique, totally.
There you go.
By the way, have you read The Broken Middle?
Have I read the which?
The Broken Middle.
Oh yeah, yes, absolutely. Yeah, I have a copy right behind me.
Okay, I might have to ask for some help at some point with that text.
You'll be lucky. But yeah, it's brilliant though, and she was really an amazing teacher and writer.
Yeah, I'm a fan. Again,
good. I didn't know there were still Gillian Rose fans around. Well done.
Well, I was just looking at the introduction to Hegel in my 19th century philosophy reader, but in that introduction, written by Robert Stern. So I don't know enough about Hegel to know where he falls, in all these battles, but he makes the claim that in the end of his introduction that Hegel is a kind of realist, which isn't exactly necessarily, I guess, the same thing as a materialist, but because universality is inherent in individuality, and that Hegel was, not a nominalist. So, the universals are not merely like some sort of mental conceptual construct, but they're working through in the world. And so insofar as the dialectic is actually an ontological, not merely a mental process that you can, and he just makes the case that this is one of the contradictions that Hegel is trying to finesse, is this distinction between idealism and realism. That right there is another kind of dialectic. And so to call him nothing more than an idealist would be an error, he seems to be arguing. So, I mean, would that mean that then calling him a purely, well, I don't know. I was going to say that doesn't necessarily mean that the accusation of formalism collapses, though, because you could say it's still a formalism, even if it is an ontological formalism.
Yeah, I think the accusation of formalism has more weight to it than the idealism. That there are no idealists. It doesn't make sense, right? Because everyone's got some account of material nature. There's no idealist that doesn't have some account of material nature. What they say is it's not what the vulgar think it is. It's not what common sense dictates. If you think it through, right, there isn't, I mean, even Berkeley or something, right? He's not saying there aren't tables, whatever. He's saying your common sense understanding of what comprises a table doesn't make any philosophical sense. This is what you must mean. So it's an account. Idealists are really giving an account of materiality. There are no idealists. Discuss.
Hunter, can you hear us?
Yeah.
Nice shit, Hunter.
Hey, thanks.
By the way, you gotta the scene.
Yeah, it's a good day. It's a good day. I'm here. I've got my sword. I've got my buckler. All right, and I've got my PBR. I've got all the thesis, antithesis, and the synthesis. Nice, dude.
I caught it.
It's sort of like
Joseph called it.
the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis of Hegel, his famous triad that he loves. It's sort of like that. And I personally love that reading of Hegel. I think that's the one subjectively correct. Teleology is true. And we're all going to resolve into absolute knowing once I am done with my work. Don't worry. But other than that, that's my thought.
So we were I don't know how much you caught, but what we started with was talking, or what Chase started with was talking about Heidegger's critique that Hegel's analysis of time is, well, that the dialectic in general becomes overly formal, and that he says there's this dialectic of spirit and there's the dialectic of time, and they have the same formal structure, but then he says that spirit falls into time, which that's not dialectical. Right. It's just like this, we got to put these two together somehow. So let's say that spirit falls into time. So that's kind of what we've been talking about.
Well, if I could just give I wish, because I figured what would happen is I would say, I like Hegel. And then somebody would say, oh yeah, well, if you like Hegel, then you must agree with this really obviously insane conception of him here. And I would say no. And then somebody would respond, well, then can you give me an account from your alternative reading for all of the examined phenomena, which Heidegger has enumerated? Can you give an alternative account for how those arise? And here's what I would say. No, because I like a lot of what Heidegger is saying in certain points. There are certain moments where I'm like, Heidegger and I, Marty and I have severe disagreements on the dialectic itself, on what the dialectic is and what it's supposed to be, and on what its ramifications are. Anyway, however, there are certain elements here. Heidegger and I are reading the same book, and so Heidegger and I will agree on certain things. Yes, Hegel did say that. And when Heidegger's enumerating certain moves in the structure of particular arguments of Hegel's, I read it and I say, I agree. Spirit does fall into time. Like, for example, spirit really does fall into time. And yes, space is time, and time is the truth. It's blah, blah, blah. I can agree with a lot of these things. But I think that because it's like think of it like math. I guess the way I'm thinking of it is Martin and I are getting at these conclusions or insights. And yeah, by the way, I agree with Alistair, with Professor Welshman, or whatever you prefer. I'm calling Heidegger Marty. So I figure, yeah, first name basis. I'm getting a little too Alistair. I'm getting a little too casual, I guess. But so I agree very much with that Heidegger is sympathetic to Hegel. I think there are key elements here, or key points, moments where I would say Heidegger's reading of Hegel is like spot on. It is illuminating. It is very erudite, and economical with its analysis and explanation. I really appreciate it. Now, what I'm saying is, the way I think of it is that Heidegger and I reach these interpretive or analytic conclusions. Yeah, Freddie Hegel. About Hegel. We reach these conclusions, and it's the same area, the same sort of conclusion, but following different paths to get there. And I think that because of this difference in paths to get there, I think that Heidegger has problems that I don't see. He downstream, runs into problems with his conception. Okay. So for example, spirit falling into time and the issue with its fall. And I'm not saying this is the whole of his criticism, but I just want to say, and in fact, some of his criticisms I didn't even really understand, like what was so bad about what he was saying. I was like, yeah, okay. But like one of them I could basically get, which is the one you were intimating, Nevitt. And that what Chase was mentioning, the empty formalism, the sort of empty abstract formalization of these things unto the point where they're just vacuous and can obviously be connected because they don't mean anything. Which that seems to me kind of like the downstream conclusion of like Nevitt. Remember when you told me once that you were told by a logic professor or somebody that if you start with a contradiction, anything can be proven.
Well, that's sort of a standard interpretation.
Sure.
The principle of explosion.
Right.
Okay, sure. Principle of explosion is kind of what came to mind for me as the kind of at the heart of Heidegger's critique is Hegel is positing this contradiction and the immediate unity of these concepts in contradiction, the truth of a contradiction, and how can he do it and what follows through from doing it? It's just vacuity. It's an openness. It's an emptiness. It's whatever. It's only possible in this sort of abstract and vague and completely kind of, what is it, indeterminate or the very emptiest of formal ontological and apophontical abstraction. That's kind of the only domain where that can happen. And in fact, and this is just a singular point I'm picking as like an area where I think Heidegger says something that I don't agree with. I don't understand why he says it. I mean, I understand why he says it because he conceives of the dialectic fundamentally differently from myself. But for example, when he says, okay, this is on Heidegger 435. This is roughly in the middle of 435. Second paragraph of Heidegger 435. He's talking about falling. And there's these two sentences. I just want to read two sentences. Because of this, spirit must first of all fall into time. That's the sentence I'm talking about on Heidegger 435. Because of this, spirit must first of all fall into time. It remains obscure what indeed is signified ontologically by this falling, or by the actualizing of a spirit which has power over time and really is outside of it. Just as Hegel casts a little light on the source of the time, which has thus been leveled off, he leaves totally unexamined the question of whether the way in which spirit is essentially constituted as negation is possible in any other manner than on the basis of primordial temporality. So I've got just a couple things. First off, if one conceives, I think, of this fall into time as a sort of necessary move of spirit into time as a sort of ad hoc or post hoc explanation of their unity, which is what farewell, Alistair. If you're treating the union of spirit and time, the falling of spirit into time, like Heidegger seems to be doing, as this sort of ad hoc or post hoc thing, this necessity. Oh, they have to be together. So I don't know, spirit falls into time, whatever. And how does it do that? Heidegger asks, and Hegel says, I don't know, just whatever. It just does. And it's obscure. It's permanently embedded into obscurity by everybody, Joseph and Alistair. Everybody's, as soon as I come in, everybody's like, oh my God, get the fuck out of here. But what I'm saying is, sure, if you look at it that way, then of course it's going to seem so. But the fall, the structure of the fall, as far as I understand Hegel, and in fact, I have a couple selections here, but the fall is not a sort of emergency move made by spirit in order to then be in time, which it is outside and above. I don't see that as at all being the case. In fact, the fall is a general affectation or aspect of the order of being, the logic of the order of being in general for Hegel. And okay, so just to explain, we for Hegel, we start with the fall. Everything starts with the fall. This is the thing. I think that Heidegger does not conceive of the fall in the same way that I do. I don't think that Heidegger expands the notion of fallenness and post-Lapsarianism to the degree that I think Hegel insists upon. And at least by my reading of Hegel, and maybe this is idiosyncratic, sure, but that's what I'm saying. It's a different reading from Heidegger's, which is why he and I get to different conclusions. And this is just one particular point. I'm not saying this is a knockdown, fuck you, Heidegger thing, but it's just one example case of where he and I disagree downstream. This is a case of the fall. On the notion of the fall, he and I disagree. I see Hegel as conceiving of the fall as a thing that is, it's the whatever. It's the first. It's not the first. It is, I guess, the logically primary event, step, element, aspect, you whatever call it, fallenness of all possible things. Everything is fallen. Fallen from what? From the origin. That's the only thing it could fall from, its origin. A thing falling from its origin is it risking passing away or becoming other than what it is. The origin from which the thing fell, the Garden of Eden, pure immediate self-identity, whatever you want to call that, an eternal pure form that is not corrupted by the malicious influences of time, pre-fallen stuff, those do not exist, and they never have. There was never a before the fall, and there was never a place to fall from. There's just a fall. We start with the fall, and pre-fallenness, being not fallen, whatever, origin, is an empty, illusory, retroactive projection. Timelessness, eternality, in the sense of like subspecia aeterna, is a retroactive construction. We do not degrade in time. Forms do not get degraded through time. This is sort of, and there are points of agreement, strong points of agreement, but this is a point of contention between sort of a Platonist view and the more Aristotelian bent that Hegel had. We do not degrade by falling into time and passing away through time, but in time only then can we retroactively imagine some fullness of being from which we then fall. And in fact, in that falling, in that degrading, in that whatever, and it's not a real degrading, but in that apparent degradation, there's a process of self-othering. Sich anders werden. I think, is that it? Sich anders werden in German, self-othering. And that means sich can be any kind of sich. Self can be any kind of self. The thing can be any kind of thing, which then, in its fallenness, others itself from itself. Self-othering. This taking a risk of expanding beyond its origin and negating itself in order to be actual. And the only way that a thing can have truth is in its actuality. or at least with its actuality involved. And so the only way for a thing to be what it is, in a way, is to move away from what it is, to other itself, to engage in the process of self-othering away from its originary point. Origin is not a fullness or a completeness or a wholeness. It is an empty, illusory void. And so all things are fallen. And I agree, Nevitt, that Heidegger sees that things as beginning in fallenness, that there was never any sort of prelapsarian state. But I don't know if he's necessarily extending that same right to Hegel, because I think he's conceiving of spirit, like I said. In fact, here, let's just go to this exact point. I'm going to reread a sentence that I read on Heidegger 435. It
But
remains
isn't he quoting Hegel when he says that the spirit falls into time?
Yes, he is, but and I agree with that. But I'm going to quote Heidegger when he says, "It remains obscure what indeed is signified ontologically by this falling or by the actualizing of spirit, which has power over time and really is outside of it." Now, the notion of spirit being really outside of time, and really, you know, this what I don't speak German, but seienden, having this this self-subsistence outside of time that then falls into time. Heidegger, in a sense, is accusing Hegel of conceiving of something in a prelapsarian state, qua spirit, right? I.e. spirit, at least at some point. Heidegger is accusing Hegel of theorizing a spirit that is, at least in some formal sense, before, and it's substantially so. Substantially so. It is separate, apart, away from, above, outside of, on the shoulder of, whatever you want to say, time. Now, what I'm saying is, I think that this is all downstream of a disagreement between Heidegger and I on the dialectic. Heidegger seems to conceive of the dialectic as a transmutative process of thesis and antithesis and synthesis. And I can understand why he's saying that. And in fact, it's a good map for figuring out the point negating itself from remaining in subsistence, and then its negation of itself is how it's grasped in being. Then it differentiates the no longer and the not yet, the this or that emerges. It's a solid analogy. I can understand the parallel, but that's as far as I'm willing to take it. I think that the analogy of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, transmuting into these sort of alchemical processes, up and up and up and up, in some sort of progression, or not even up, just towards or away from or whatever, in a direction, directionally, I would say that is a parallel to the movement that I see as happening. But I don't necessarily see it as I don't really I guess I don't agree. I don't agree with that reading of the dialectic. And I think that it has, let's see, I wrote down, I think I think when I conceive of the dialectic, or of a dialectical relationship between two poles, two terms, let's say two terms. The second term is not, let's say, an antithesis, which is then transmuted into anything new. I don't see that as happening. What I see in the process, in the dialectical process, for a term in Hegel, and again, maybe we could just say these are parallel and hard to. It's not a bright line. It's not a bright line, but I see it as a singular term. Let's say space has inconsistencies or incoherence, points of incoherence or inconsistencies or what have you. And those are made manifest in some way, and that thing is referred to as the oppositional term or the antithesis. By people who I disagree with, they would call it the antithesis. But it's not a thing. It's not a thing that can stand on its own two legs. It's not a thing after transmutation. It's not any of that. It is the fullest expression of the first term. Space brought to its fullest end brings about this distinguishing, this differentiating, and this temporalizing, this time. Okay, formalism and empiricism. Formalism doesn't need to be transmuted in order to become empiricism. It just has to go to the end. Formalism at its end is a formal comparison or analysis of the limits of human formalization, i.e. an empiricism. Let's try with empiricism. Empiricism at its end is a full subsumption under, or an ultimate, and even maybe not at the beginning, but an ultimate reliance on some form, a pre-given form. And so it's not a transmutation. It's not a transmutation of any substantial thing. All right. And it's not this, yeah, that's what I'd say. It's not, they aren't substantial entities, and they are not, and I'm not accusing Heidegger necessarily of calling them substantial entities that sit on in themselves, but he speaks of them as if they are, and that irks me. So they're not substantial, and they're not transmutated in any sense. I see it instead as a purely within the thing itself, moving to its fullest expression. It becomes, it embodies, it can be only properly named the thing we see as its opposite. Formalism, empiricism, essence, appearance, time, space, what have you. So that core problem that I see, and basically, if you want to get my notion of the because I know because everybody's so interested about what's going on in my brain, right? The triad in my mind is not thesis, antithesis, synthesis. For me, the triad, if there is one dialectically, which there is, in a sense, there's the term. Just forget thesis, forget antithesis, forget synthesis. You just have the term. And the thing people call the antithesis is just the name we give to the lack or inconsistency of the first term. The first term exists. It has some problems that it can't address. It has some content that exceed the form. Content exceeds the form in the first term. The name of that excess is the second term. And the difference between the two is made manifest as the third term. I'll give you an example. In psychoanalysis, the masculine and the feminine jouissance. Masculinity and its lack or inconsistency being called femininity, and then the difference between the two being given the name plus, or plus. Sure, Jacques Lacan's anxiety, MF plus. There's a formulation in the 11th seminar on MF plus. It's the first term, the name of its lack, and then the name of the difference between the two. It's really getting back to difference and differentiating and differentiation writ large. And in fact, there are some sections in here where I felt like Heidegger was getting really close to referring to spirit as the form of pure difference itself. And if he did that, I would have been on my feet pumping my fist. I would be like, yeah! But he never really got there. I happen to believe that, in a sense, spirit is the form of pure difference itself, which I know Deleuze is on about. So anyway, that's it. That's my stance on that stuff. I will try to get tech stuff answered, or not answered, but I'll try to just respond to stuff that people were typing in the chat while I was talking.
If nobody else wants to say anything first, okay. So one thing that that I was curious about was, so one thing that, at least I'm not sure how to position this, maybe that Heidegger thinks about Hegel is he seems to, this is one thing I noticed, is that he seems to have, at least in this regard, something of a similar interpretation that, well, I think this is pretty faithful to Hegel, at least as far as I know, but that it starts with the abstract and becomes increasingly more concrete. And that's also what towards the very last paragraph of 82, right before 83, you get Heidegger's kind of, he gives this long thing about Hegel, and then you're kind of like, well, how does this compare with his own thing? And he doesn't really say until this very last paragraph exactly. But there, I think this first sentence is pretty indicative of what's kind of going on between the two. So I'll just read it. Our existential analytic of Dasein, on the contrary, starts with the concretion of factically thrown existence itself, in order to unveil temporality as that which primordially makes such existence possible. Spirit does not first fall into time, but it exists as the primordial temporalizing of temporality. Temporality temporalizes world-time within the horizon of which history can appear as historizing within time. Spirit does not fall into time, but factical existence falls as falling from primordial authentic temporality. This falling, however, as itself its existential possibility in a mode of its temporalizing, a mode which belongs to temporality. Anyways, I think the interesting thing is that he stresses that he's starting with the concretion of factically thrown existence itself in order to unveil temporality as primordial conditions of existential possibility. So that seems to be the opposite of what Hegel's doing. And that reminds me also, it's something kind of also Bergson's, he doesn't specify that it's about Hegel, but I suspect it is. He says something similar where he also wants to start with the concrete. And he says that if you start with general concepts that are abstract, that will not lead towards, you can't negate those in order to get more concrete concepts. They'll only lead to other abstract concepts. And I don't know, I'm not sure where I stand on those things, but it kind of, at least that makes sense of some of the frustrations I get with reading Hegel, where I'm kind of like, okay, where is this stuff coming from? Like, okay, we got some kind of now point that's negating itself. Where, how, who, what, where, where's this occurring? And, so some of the logic that Hegel does will make sense to me, but then I'm like, well, where did the original positing of this abstract now come from? It's not, reading the phenomenology, that was also a point where I couldn't understand, like, where's any of this stuff, where's it happening? Like, I know that's probably like a false question or whatever, but it was just like, I couldn't get a grasp of what was going on. I could see like that there was a kind of a dynamic occurring and whatnot, but I don't know. I got the sense also with this thing of where he's talking about this whatever transmutation or whatever from space to time through this now point, the now negating stuff. So I understand that thing where like, oh, okay, the now is this indifferent difference. It differentiates from itself, and then from that you can get something like time. But then I'm like, well, where did that original, the insufficient concept of space there to begin with? It's like, where did that come from? And where is this occurring? Like, this is occurring conceptually, but what, in like Hegel's mind, in our mind? Is it in a mind? is that a false question? Am I totally off? Do I just need to drink more PBR?
No,
I don't know.
I can speak on that with three pithy, hand wavy GE Moore style responses. Okay, so I'm sorry if they suck, but I'm ready. First off, on the notion of abstraction, Hegel has a cool paper called. It's not really a paper; it's an article he wrote for the newspaper. That Eric, have you read this? This is one of my favorite write-ups by Hegel ever. Who thinks abstractly? What an awesome paper! It was when he was young and really cavalier. And he was like, oh, everybody talk who thinks abstractly. You're right. Only old fuddy-duddies and weirdos think abstractly. And then he lists like every kind of person ever, like very exotic, and is like, here's a person thinking abstractly. And he's like, how about this? How about a woman in a marketplace who tells an old woman who's selling eggs. She says to the woman, you're selling rotten eggs. And then the old woman responds with, oh yeah? Well, your father was eaten by lice, and your mother was a whore, and your children died of dysentery.
Oh, no, I know what it is. It's well, your eggs are rotten or something like that, and your grandmother's and your mother's too.
Yes.
Deleuze and Guattari, they actually reference that story when they're talking about opinion.
Yes.
And they're like, opinion has a connection with insult. And then they give Hegel's story about the grandmother with the rotten eggs. And I'm just like, what is this? So
that's
I remember
throwback.
that. Yeah.
That's crazy that they did that's a throwback they did. They were like, nobody's gonna get this until like 2025 when there's like a database of Hegel articles. But
I think in my annotation next to it, I just wrote like cool story Hegel bro. I think I just wrote that, and that was it. It was great. Yeah.
I'm interested in the things you're saying, Nevin, but I just want to my two more pithy things. In the question of where's the now, it's right here. It's right here, right now. And I'll give you a case of point or proof of concept. The beginning of for the phenomenology after the preface is sensuous certainty. What is the initial thesis of sensuous certainty? I have a this. What's a this? What is this? This and its thisness. It's
here
this
and now, right?
This and its thusness now and here. And then the sensuous certainty writes it down. I'm right here, right now. And then later that night, it reads that note and says, wait a minute, am I still right here, right now? It runs into problems. You know what I'm saying? So the where is the here, where is the now? It starts with the sensuous certainty. And that actually gets into my third point of you were saying, how do we get to this point in space that then negates and in fact negates the negation? Where do we get that? Actually, Heidegger makes a point that I totally agree with about Hegel's reading, which is that the being, capital B being, is in a sense self-same with being thought. And so, yes, I would say you asked that you as a kind of a joke, you said, where is all this happening? Like in the mind of Hegel? I would say, yeah, actually.
Yeah, no, that wasn't a joke. I was really thinking that. Yeah.
No, well then great, because
at least as a hypothesis. But yeah. Anyway, sorry, your answer.
I really do agree with it. It's like in Faust, the zeitgeist is the mind of the man reflecting on that age. The point in space that does the negating. We are here. Let me try and rephrase it this way. We all are points in space that are negating themselves. You know what I mean? Just to begin the analysis, our bodies are amalgamations of, and this whole dichotomy or this weird analysis of the point in space is space and the place of space, the whole amalgam of points that is also space. I think of it in this way. It's almost like I was reading. I have these ants. I have ants. I just moved into a new apartment, and there are ants, and they piss me off. And I was Googling today because I Google things that piss me off. Oh yeah, I hate ants. I'll tell you what. You have a book for everything. Every single thing.
It's the
It's the same one.
Yeah.
Oh, it happens to be coming up. So I have these ants, right? And I was Googling, fuck ants, I hate them. What happens if every ant went extinct? I literally will Google things that don't make sense and that aren't rational thoughts just to get the sense that somebody else has had the same irrational thought as me. So I just Googled the phrase today, all ants should go extinct. I just Googled that because I hate them. And then somebody on Reddit said, I think ants are evil and I hate them. And I was like, okay, good. Well, at least I'm not enough of a loser to post about it. It made me feel better. But here was the point. Somebody said in response, here are some pragmatic solutions to you. You can do X, Y, and Z, blah, blah, blah. You can kill as many ants as you wish. Yeah, I'd be a terrible soil scientist. That's right. But you would be like, you can kill as many ants as you wish, but killing the queen or poisoning the colony. This is something, somebody said something extremely interesting in this stupid Reddit post. They said, killing the colony is what kills the animal itself. The colony is the real animal in question here. And I said, I thought to myself, ooh la la, that is such an interesting point to make. Because in a sense, the ants, the individual ants are like the points in space, and the colony itself being space. They're both ants and they're both animals. You see what I'm saying? But the proper animal is the colony. Would you say ants are a rhizome? I think ants are a plague. Fuck ants. I don't. Yeah. Fuck. Yeah. Fuck ants. That's right. I'm looking at this T-shirt that Nevitt just linked. That's right. All your rhizomes and you're crawling through my outlets. It's well, and I just want to make a final, and this is a little bit more adversarial. This is my last point. It's a little bit more adversarial. This sort of conception that I agree, Chase, it depends on some idealist principles. If Hegel's anything, he's arch-idealist. It depends on these sort of idealist presuppositions and starting points that we might find, at the very least, able to be questioned, open to questioning. And Hegel treats them as very much like obvious, and just fuck you, it's obvious. And so when you're saying, I agree with you, where it's like, whoa, hey, whoa, let's slow it down. I'm totally in agreement. But I think a downstream conclusion of this this following those idealist methods and principles that Hegel lays out, right? Following those as being true or good versus continuing the line of questioning on those principles. Those are the two approaches we could take to Hegel's blustering. Let's say Hegel's up at the podium blustering and sniffling and coughing and hawking loogies and doing his thing. You know, I am in the audience going, ooh, I agree with everything that he says because I love him. And he's like a weird pseudo father figure to me. It's some sort of, psychoanalytic, trauma response way. You, on the other hand, are slightly more objective and saying, I'm not so sure, right? I think that the downstream conclusion, this is where the battleground is for Deleuze and Guattari. This is to try and make it more relevant. The contemporary disagreement is on whether or not a rhizomatic treatment of the subject or a nomadic subject at all is in any way in contest with or antagonistic to forms of prescriptive domination and social edification. Is a nomadic subject actually adversarial or antagonistic in any sense to a prescriptive social edifice? The Hegelians, who are all into it, would say, no, you've got to do all this other stuff, and it's weird. And the Deleuze and Guattarians, who are all into Deleuze and Guattari because they like that he's got weird hair and they are interested in him or whatever, they're saying, yes, it is adversarial to contemporary forms of domination. We all should be nomadic. And the Hegelians, some like Zizek, in fact, directly reference this, saying, no, I don't think the nomadic subject is ultimately in tension at all with contemporary forms of capitalist domination. It's, in fact, sort of a necessary element of, it's like the necessary obverse, dirty, obscene, ooky spooky side of the normative, bureaucratic edifice of the social structure, or you see what I'm saying? The rational state. The rational state. That would be, I think, what Hegel would call it. And yeah, I've got a lot of things coming out. We're talking about orifices and things coming out. I've got something coming out of one of my orifices. I can tell you that much. And I don't know if it's necessarily good thinking, but it's certainly something. But those are my pithy, dismissive answers to what you asked.
That was helpful. The last point on the nomadic subject, though, I would say, I mean, if it's a topic that actually interests you, the postscripts for a society of control, which is very, very short, 4 pages or something like that. I think that shows that there's an understanding of the way that contemporary control societies through techno capital and whatnot, that they enforce a kind of necessary modulation of what y'all will call the subject, so there's definitely an awareness of those things, and it's a complex relation of the whole kind of, at least in anti-Oedipus, more so kind of like you've got the schizo thing, the schizo process, the tendency, but that's an acceleration of also the tendency that is in capitalism itself, but it just accelerates past the capitalism needs, though, limits to its own tendency. So the tendency that goes past those limits, that's what schizophrenia is. So it's a complex kind of relation where it's kind of like the interior difference outside of or surpassing the limits of the wall of capital that it needs to have its own kind of like recapitulation of its formal structures and whatnot. But anyways, I think I'm just talking about that because I think I actually have more of an idea of what I'm talking about when I talk about Deleuze and Guattari, where this stuff I'm just like, I don't fucking know. But anyways, there's another thing I was going to talk about. I can't remember. So this is not related necessarily, but well, I mean, okay. So ants. I had an interesting experience once when I went to my brother's house to spend the night. It's this nice house, like it was built like a year before or something. Very clean and whatnot. I go to this bed, I'm about to go to sleep, and I pull the covers back, and there's just ants everywhere. Just ants. And I just watched Blue Velvet again, I think for the second or third time, just like a few days before. And that there's ants in that. And then I was just like, oh my God, what is going on? Am I dreaming? Like, this is so surreal and dreamlike. This is interesting. So I went and showed my brother, can you confirm there's ants in this bed? Where are they coming from? Couldn't figure it out. And I just kind of forgot about it. And then I went back an hour later, they're completely gone. The ants are completely gone. They've escaped. I don't know, took a line of flight somewhere. You never know where the rhizome's going to go. But yeah, ants, they're out of control, man. Yeah. I had to explain to my mom the other day about how ants are rhizomes, and that's why she was okay. There's ants eating some stuff around my room, and then she was all concerned about like where they are spatially located, and I was like, that doesn't matter. It's a rhizome. It's a smooth space, a nomadic war machine. They could pop up in any place. Like, come on. The vortical body, like, it covers space, it occupies space. It's not in space, it is space. And I think she eventually got it because she also showed me she dug up this plant that it was like, this is a rhizome. And I saw it. So that's my story. Once again, I feel better talking about rhizomes than whatever the hell is going on with Hegel.
Well, I
Which
wanted to.
I feel like I have a slightly better idea, but it's still, I don't know. I would have to devote several years to understanding Hegel, I feel like, to do him justice.
I feel the same way about daily. I wanted to just say in response, first off, that's exactly why whenever Hegel comes up in the Heidegger, I'm like, ooh, yay! Finally, a break, respite from the eternal suffering. It's just fabulous. But I wanted to say two things that are directed at Nevitt, if that's all right, to the room. Nevitt, I've got two things to say to you. First off, I wanted to bring up a point that made me think of Nietzsche. And then the second thing is, I want to go against what you said in the text, where you said, "Oh, you don't have to respond to your crowd." I don't actually have a response. I wanted you to elaborate on them with your voice, so because I think you're making like a really good point that's a genuinely novel and interesting to me. Because I was the disagreement that Nevin and I had in the text in the chat was that I was saying Heidegger, by proposing authentic time from which Dasein falls, my belief, and I'm willing to accept this might be erroneous completely, but my belief was that the goal of this theorizing was to give people sort of a path, sort of like Shakyamuni giving the path out of suffering, giving people a path towards authenticity, and in a sense, that authenticity being a real state that can be returned to in some sense, even if it's a modification of inauthenticity. But if not, I really want to know why. Now, before we get on to that, I just had a smaller thing that I wanted to, just because I thought Nevitt would think this is interesting. So Nevitt, you know how you and I have talked about the will to power and how it ultimately resolves into this like self-overcoming thing? Yeah. Okay. On Heidegger 434, the first full paragraph, of Heidegger 434, the first full paragraph, he has an interesting set of statements made there. I just want to, I'm not going to read the whole paragraph, but I'll read just the second sentence up to the point that I think is interesting. In this, so what is it? The progression of the spirit which actualizes itself in history carries with it a principle of exclusion. Hegel would actually call that abbreviation, but in this exclusion, however, that which is excluded does not get detached from the spirit, it gets surmounted. The kind of making itself free which overcomes and at the same time tolerates is characteristic of the freedom of the spirit. And this is an aside, I would say that this is a solid reading, but I think it misunderstands a few things. Thus, progress never signifies a merely quantitative more, but is essentially qualitative and indeed has the quality of spirit. Progression is done knowingly and knows itself in its goal. In every step of its progress, spirit has to overcome itself as the truly malignant obstacle to that goal. In its development, spirit aims to reach its own concept. The development itself is a hard, unending battle against itself. So, okay, I think that smacks of a Nietzschean. I mean, it's not Nietzsche's formula, but it leads to that thing that made me think of Nietzsche's ultimate sort of notion of the final battle is with yourself. And Nevitt, you might remember I really would be shocked if you did actually. I wrote a terrible paper for you about movies and about Nietzsche and Kierkegaard. You remember my movies paper?
Uh-huh.
Okay. Yes. In that, a character in the movie I was using to describe Nietzsche, the final scene is the character lighting himself on fire, like fully immolating and sacrificing himself to something greater, because he just committed like a genocide of a small town. And maybe it's because he feels guilt, whatever his reasoning is, he immolates himself as a sort of visual representation of a self-overcoming in a sense. Now, what I want to say about this is that I don't know how Nietzsche conceives of that self-overcoming. Like, if it's like a sort of path of betterment. I don't think so, though. I think Nietzsche would say it's definitely not, he wouldn't call it a progress. It's just an overcoming. It's not an overcoming in a progression towards anything. It's not directionally aimed at anything. Right. Self-mastery, not necessarily self-improvement. You know what I'm saying? It's not like self-improvement, it's self-mastery of whatever's there. And this is the point that you make a lot, Nevitt, is that it's a battleground of forces that are not, and the dominant impulse is not always the best one. It's not, it's just that it is the dominating impulse at the time. So what I'm saying is, I think that this is my point. This is my whole point. Heidegger conceives of Hegel as proposing a progression of spirit. I think that the way he describes this progression implies a sort of development into greater and greater manifolds of qualities and quantities. And so the obstacle, the self, really is an obstacle towards something better or greater or more conclusive or more whole or more totalizing. I would say that that is not Hegel's mission statement or perspective. From my reading, I think that the only way in which Hegel sees progression is there are two possible ways that Hegel reads progression. One is in a limited sense. In the limited local definition of progression, there is some semblance of what we would call change or development into higher sublimations, greater degrees of sublimation. So like, I'll give you an example. Zizek, actually, Zizek likes to focus on how things fall apart in their dialectical maneuvering. Hegel emphasizes how they grow and develop. Both are possible, but it's a matter of emphasis. Hegel emphasizes and focuses on the growth, the development. That's a local phenomenon. When we think of it as being like a growth or a development or a progression towards greater and greater anything, or having a directionality at all, it's a local phenomenon. But globally speaking, this is the second way to read progression. Progression does not mean, it's not progression at all. It's actually a series of collapses, failures, and breakdowns that occur that are not necessarily overcome, but are redirected or retooled. It's kind of like let's say I'm a track and field star and I am late for my track and field meeting. And so that's a failure or a collapse in my construction of my subjectivity or whatever, or my ends and aims. But because I was late to my track and field meeting, I got to spend 15 more minutes with my sweetie, with my sweetheart, my high school, whatever, my love affair, who reveals to me that she's in love with me or something, whatever. It's not no, yeah, exactly. Chase hit it the nail on the head. Not a resolution of contradiction or conflict, but a sort of pivot, like how can we make this defeat into a sort of victory in a way? How can we, it's a search for a silver lining and then a redirection of effort. That's really how I conceive of Hegel's global notion of progression. It's like a train on a track that has a total fundamental breakdown and it can't keep moving. And then the only way it can keep moving is by completely changing course. Sometimes backwards, but it has to completely, it's not overcoming or resolving contradictions or antagonisms. It's a coping, I suppose, maybe with failure and breakdown and so on. Maybe a deterritorial. Actually, Joey, that's a very interesting point, because this would be my, if I was an asshole, I'd be like, yeah, that Deleuzian term, deterritorializing. This is the thing. Deleuze was a Hegelian too. Very good observation. Yes, he didn't know it, but Deleuze was also a Hegelian. Even if he didn't understand why he was a Hegelian or that he was a Hegelian, he really was, which is actually true. I think to a certain degree, I think Chase and Joey, I think based on y'all's reading of Deleuze, I would say that on my reading of Hegel, I think there are a lot of points of agreement, like on the notion of pure difference itself as a field. I see that totally. I completely agree. And the notion of like deterritorializing and its parallels with this sort of progression of the Hegelian spirit. Sure, like I really do see that parallel, and I agree with that. Now, back to Nevitt. I wanted you, Nevitt, if it was still possible or relevant or within your wheelhouse or your energy, I wanted to know if you wanted to actually talk anymore at all about that disagreement, about whether or not Heidegger posits a prelapsarian state that can be achieved. That's my question.
Okay, before that, I wanted to comment about what you just said in that paragraph. I guess I'm really disappointed. Yeah, can you hear my cat screaming in the background? Billy's just like, wah, wah, I don't know what he wants. Anyway, I'm sort of disappointed that you didn't like that paragraph because I really liked it. And I mean, one of the reasons I liked that paragraph was because, whenever we talked about Hegel in the 19th century class, no matter who, this question always comes up: to what degree is Heidegger teleological, and does he think there's really some end final state? And one thing I liked about this paragraph is I read Heidegger saying no. It's an always ongoing process. The development, and again, some of the stuff is he's quoting Hegel, but of course, again, he's the fact that he's picking quotations out means that he may not be giving them a proper reading. But, he says in the last sentence of that paragraph you read, the development of itself is, quote, a hard, infinite struggle against itself, which suggests to me that it's a forever ongoing process, which I thought was, I like that idea, rather than saying he thinks that the dialectic is going to achieve some ultimate state and then we're done. And I also liked the idea, and maybe it's because, like you said, it has this Nietzschean flavor. Maybe that's why I liked it. But it made, part of the reason I liked it is because it made sense. I could understand I can make sense of Hegel reading it the way Heidegger does here. As he says, progression is known and knowing itself in its goal. In every step of its progress, spirit has to overcome itself as the truly inimical hindrance of its aim. The goal of its development, of the development of spirit, is quote, to attain its own concept. I like that idea. I mean, I'll put it this way. I can make sense of Hegel in that sense. Like it's an ongoing, forever unfolding process of spirit aiming to achieve its concept and it's never going to get there.
I agree with that. I just want to say I do think that that's a solid reading of Hegel. I just want to clarify.
So, okay, well, I liked that. And one little naive, based on what you guys have been talking about, this sounds naive to me, but part of the sense I got from some of the stuff Heidegger was saying is that time actually is what happens when the spirit does its dialectical thing. In other words, in order for spirit to move toward achieving its concept, that necessarily involves movement, which then necessarily involves time. I thought some of the stuff that Heidegger was saying sort of pointed to that kind of a reading, which again, I like just because I could make sense of it. That I'm not sure how well that fits into the spirit falling into time thing, but I thought of it, well, maybe the dialectic necessarily, because it is a process, and because that maybe the achieving its concept necessarily requires a temporal process of change. And so then that could make some sense of how time comes into it. But again, maybe that's just a cartoonish way of thinking about it, which avoids the fundamental problem. So anyway, I actually like that paragraph. So with regard to those other comments, so my reading, because Heidegger from the very beginning says, I don't know if he used this language, there was no prelapsarian state. There never has been. We've always been fallen from the very beginning, always already. There never was ontologically or temporally any pre-fallen state. There just never was. I mean, I think he uses that word because I think he is. I mean, I wonder if he's trying to sort of call up in a very general sense the notion of the Christian fall, but only in the sense that it is we have this feel, and this is why like, I don't not it doesn't sound that much different from the way you described Hegel. We experience our state as less than or not, in some sense less than what it should be. And so that we have this, we sort of project backward that there must have been some state that was better than this or different than this. And at least it seems like you were describing Hegel in those terms. And I think, I don't know, that's the same sense I got from Heidegger, that he uses the word fall for pretty much exactly the same reason, that Dasein is always already fallen. And when we come to grips with, and part of it has to do with the facticity and the thrownness and all that stuff. And it's what we are and who we are. And I don't think authenticity ever gets back to, I don't think for one thing, I don't think he ever thinks, my sense is, and I'm just guessing here really, that Heidegger would say there is just no way to ever get back. I mean, because we are always already fallen and inauthentic. And that, and as I said, and you even mentioned this, any mode of authenticity is always a modification of inauthenticity. And so inauthenticity, fallenness, is the fundamental sort of ground state of Dasein. And, the impression I get, you can have these, I don't know what he really means by moment, but that, you can move toward a I don't know what, a more authentic existence. But there's always going to be this gravity, this drag that is always going to be dragging us back into inauthenticity. And so maybe it's different from Hegel in that regard. Maybe Hegel would say, well, there is no such thing as an authentic. I don't know, maybe, I defer to you, but that maybe Hegel would say there is no anything like authenticity, and there's no point in trying to do anything, different. But so I do agree that Hegel thinks that or Heidegger thinks it's possible to move toward authenticity, but I don't get the sense that he would ever think there's going to be like a Jesus Christ authentic person. It's like kind of like students ask me sometime, does Aristotle think there really is a thoroughly virtuous human being, that's a real possibility? I actually think he does. I think Aristotle thinks, yeah, I know some of those guys that are magnanimous. I'm probably one of them, but I don't think Heidegger thinks that about authenticity. So, and I don't think it's ever that Heidegger thinks it's ever possible toward, let's see, reading what you're saying there.
Well, I just want to, I just would say, yeah. So then what Heidegger and Hegel seem to agree on is that there's no attainment of that state. And you're right. I think Hegel would probably say, look, the search for authenticity, you need to analyze that search itself more closely in order to figure out what it is you're actually gesturing toward, or what do you feel you lack? Because I think Hegel would say authenticity, it's a form, it's maybe desirable depending on how we define it, I suppose, but is it sort of an obviously desirable thing? No, not necessarily. And is there a way to even, is there a real formally grounded motivation or justification for struggling towards authenticity? No, I don't know about that either, really. So I'm with you but they can disagree on that all day. But what our disagreement, as you're saying, they're not in disagreement on that at all. Is there a prelapsarian state that can be reached? They're not in disagreement about that. Now, whether or not they're in disagreement about the value of authenticity, that's a whole other thing. But what we can agree on and what they can agree on is that there is no prelapsarian state. And there was never any point in time in history where people were before that fall. Okay.
Yeah, I think so. I, you know, and with regard, I mean, I got the same question. I don't really understand what Heidegger, you know, why pursue authenticity. I mean, I think part of it is this this notion of unity, the unity of the person, you know, that we started seeing toward the end, you know, where you know there's this way of sort of hanging your life together as a coherent life from birth to death, and as a sort of unity of, I mean, which I mean, there's got to be some connections here. Or I'll put it, doesn't have to be. I get this vague sense that he's struggling with some of the things that Kant is struggling with when he's talking about the unity of the transcendental unity of a perception, but that there's a way of experiencing one's life as a unified structure, and that seems to be worth pursuing. And there seems to be he seems to place some value in living a life that has that unified structure and that has sort of a clarity and an understanding of what the hell's going on here. But I guess why is that better than living a life of fallenness in the they? I don't know. I have a good sense of how Heidegger would answer that question.
Well,
So I'm not sure he really says necessarily that that is the case, that, you know, especially as a kind of, you know, this is the case, and for all cases that there's some kind of, you know, ethical motivation for authenticity. It does seem to be somewhat tacitly implied in his description of it, but yeah, I don't think he really gives an answer to say why authenticity would be preferable to inauthenticity. There's some things you can maybe say, but those would then kind of presuppose something else. Okay, so for example, he talks about there's a joy with anxiety, authentic anxiety. So you'd say, oh, well, that's good. Joy's good. But then, you know, Heidegger hasn't exactly established the ontology of good and joy, which is what Heidegger, in all of his anal retentiveness, would demand. So I think that's why when he talks about things like, okay, values and all that stuff, you know, the good conscience, the bad conscience, all these questions, he kind of dismisses those and says those are ontologically indeterminate. In order to ground them, you'd have to say something about how they're attached to Dasein's kind of being and all this stuff. So I think, yeah, just basically to repeat myself again, I think it's somewhat implicated, but he's not necessarily saying that authenticity is preferable to inauthenticity, and for certain reasons. It's just kind of implicated, but I think he's more just kind of trying to establish that there is authenticity and inauthenticity, and those are very important methodologically. He needs authenticity as something that is there as a possibility, in order to ultimately explain also why, okay, if we've got the case of everydayness where most of us are inauthentic, how do we explain that? And how do we explain the possibility for authenticity to be able to have this relation with our own most non-relational self and all this stuff. So I think he needs those as structures. But then that kind of well, so in anxiety, you're present you encounter the possibility of choosing either authenticity or inauthenticity. It becomes you become aware of it as two different possibilities that you can still run away from, and there's kind of tranquility that he talks about with that, as absorbing yourself in the they self and whatnot. But then there's also something else that goes along with, well, if I go with the authentic possibility, there's also certain affective kind of things going on there too. But yeah. So another thing that I was thinking about with that one passage about the kind of quasi Nietzschean thing about progress and overcoming and all that. So when he talks in here about thus progress never signifies a merely quantitative more, but is essentially qualitative, and indeed is the quality of spirit. So I think Heidegger's stressing the qualitative aspect because that goes along with his whole strategy of saying that these philosophers, everyone except him, they've all kind of gone along with they have the traditional concept of time that goes along with the ordinary or vulgar conception of time. And what he wants to do with that, so he says that basically all philosophers they're just all kind of doing something related to Aristotle, who kind of perfected at the very beginning the ordinary concept of, or yeah, is that right? The traditional concept, so that the conceptual apparatus expands on the ordinary understanding of time, which that itself is preconceptual, but the conceptual, philosophical, explicit, that's the traditional concept of time. And he's saying that Aristotle kind of nailed it at first, and then Hegel is the most radical development of it. And there's also some weird stuff with Bergson going on, like right there too, where on this point he says that Bergson and Hegel are like identical in their result in that regard. And so what he's trying to do there with the quality thing is, so Aristotle said that time is the measure of motion, or arithme kinesis, or something like that. And but that's connected with this quantitative aspect. So what he's saying about what he says about Bergson, and I think what he's hinting at here as well about Hegel, is that, oh, Bergson just merely reverses Aristotle from quantitative succession to qualitative succession. But in doing so, he is still trapped within Aristotle's conception of time, and therefore he is still within the traditional concept of time. So it's very important that he reduces Bergson at least to qualitative succession. And let's see what in his footnote he says. He has these two formulas. Yeah, so he reduces Bergson to two formulas. Time is space, and duration. Okay, so time is space, but that's the kind of derived time, and duration is qualitative succession. So that's where I think he wants to say that Hegel is also doing something like that, and therefore is also still trapped within Aristotle. Um, yeah, I don't necessarily buy it for Bergson, and I'm kind of suspicious about that Hegel can be reduced to qualitative succession also. I know there's like a huge section in the logic of sense all about quantity and quality. I'm guessing that's probably has something to say maybe in that would disagree with a kind of reduction of Hegel to just some kind of mere reversal of Aristotle, which seems to be I don't know. That whole idea seems bad to me. That it's like, oh, every philosopher has always thought of time as they're basically just doing Aristotle, except me. That seems kind of ridiculous, honestly.
I'm just saying in the comment, that's a common trope among philosophers.
Yeah.
Everybody fucked up, but I got
Oh,
it.
okay, you know who actually, because she was mentioned earlier, Catherine Malibu does this. I've heard a few interviews with her, and I read one of her books, and she's like full of this stuff, constantly saying like, what was one is like, anarchy has never been philosophically developed. I was like, what? I mean, maybe not adequately, like to your own satisfaction, okay, sure, but and she's like full of this stuff like, um, that the degradation of form or something like that was also another thing that she was saying like nobody's ever thought of this before. And yeah, I don't know. I was listening to something on Acid Horizon with her, and she like constantly says this stuff. She's constantly saying that like people this has never been done before. Like what?
Sounds just like Trump.
Really?
Oh
Oh
yeah, I
my
mean,
God.
yeah. I'm sorry.
Well, I just want Trump one time was like talking about the Roe v. Wade thing, and he said, I love when he says this. I love this is one of my favorite from the Professor Dr. Donnie Deals, when he's like, every legal scholar in the entire world agrees
Yeah.
that with me, every legal scholar has agreed that this was the best thing we could do. And I'm like, whoa. Like that's and it's just you can just say that. You can just say that. And what is somebody gonna stop you? No, I guess not. So yeah, Catherine Malibu could also claim like nobody's ever been thinking as clearly as me. All right. And you know, it's like the opposite of Endgame. Anyway.
A student at Texas State, I think was in one of my classes. Anyway, the student, I was walking back from class one time, and the student told me that one of the professors, philosophy professors at Texas State, who shall remain nameless,
I know who you're talking about already.
told the class that he was one of the best critical thinkers in the world.
I know
Oh
exactly.
God.
Yeah, and Hunter knows exactly who you're
Uh,
talking about.
yeah, that was the guy.
Exactly. The man has a bad reputation among his students.
Is that right?
The TAs that have had to work with him all complain.
I just, I, I'm glad you guys confirmed that because I was like, after that student told me, I thought, no, no one would say that.
I can't how does somebody seriously say that with a straight face? It just like tells like a announces that to a class of their own students. I don't know. I can't